So I'll just go ahead and welcome everybody here this is our second legislative breakfast. We are the Lamoille Economic Development Corporation and Lamoille Chamber. The LEDC is one of the 12 RDCs in the state serving economic development for all Lamoille County. This is our second breakfast. Second year, we kind of revived these since the pandemic sort of pushed them out of reality for a little while there. Thanks all for coming. This breakfast is sponsored by L2 Consulting and Stowe Bowl here right in Stowe. Jeff Lindemer is right in the middle there somewhere. I see him waving. He is L2 Consulting with his team as well, and his wife Deb. Sorry, Deb. So thanks for that support. I'm not sure if Mark Vandenberg's here. I didn't see him yet, but Mark is also a board member of ours. Greg is a board member of ours as well, or excuse me, Jeff is a board member of ours as well. So Mark Vandenberg of Stowe Bowl also helped support this event. So we appreciate them for that. Our next event will be in March at Jenna's Promise in Johnson, and then in April at Smugs. So if you'd love to see you there as well. Similar breakfast in Johnson, a little bit more of a hot breakfast in Smugs, if that's your motivation. Plenty of coffee. I think I put some bags there. If there's any food left on your way out, feel free to gather it. The bathrooms are all the way downstairs, so all the way to the bottom, and you'll find them there. So enough from me. We'll go till 9:30 sharp. If we end early, we'll end early. But we do really want to spend most of the time on your questions. But we would hopefully have the representatives introduce themselves, and maybe if there's something brief that you want to tell the group, feel free to do so. And we'll just start here on the left and work our way over.
Good morning. I'm Andrew Perchlik. This is my 6th year, 3rd term of being a state senator for the Washington District, which is all Washington County, Stowe, and then 2 towns in Orange, and Braintree. I'm on the Transportation Committee. I'm vice chair, acting chair these days because Senator Maz has been ill. And I'm also on Appropriations Committee as vice chair in Appropriations. And we're, in the Senate trying to work on 2 committees. We really focus on our committee stuff. Was on the Education Committee, and I'm probably going to be some education questions. So happy to talk about that, but mostly focus on the areas of transportation and the issues of the budget and appropriations.
Thank you. I'm Ann Watson, also a senator for the Washington District, which includes Stowe, as Senator Perchlik mentioned. Excuse me. And so I serve on the Natural Resources and Energy Committee, as well as the Government Operations Committee, and I'm actually the vice chair of the Natural Resources Committee.
And I'm Representative Mark Higley. I'm from Lowell. I represent the Orleans-Lamoille district. And that's the towns of Lowell, Jay, Westfield, Troy, Newport Center, Irisburg, Coventry, and Eden is my Lowell, Lamoille County town. I serve on government operations and also on LCAR. We've been very busy, I'm sure if you've heard, a couple of months last year on the trapping and hunting of coyotes with hounds, Fish and Wildlife rules, and now we're on to wake boats, which we took some public testimony last week. So a couple of controversial issues there, and we certainly have a lot. And I serve with Representative Boyden on government operations, so maybe she'll talk a little bit about the numerous bills that we have in GovOps. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. I'm Representative Jed Lipsky. I represent Lamoille 1 district, which is basically 7/8 of Stowe. I serve on the Agriculture, Food Resiliency, and Forestry Committee, and I've recently, at my request, been appointed as a liaison to the Education Committee in the House. Very important for our community, as it is for all Vermont communities. But aside from that, I'm very active in the Rural Caucus, which represents all of Vermont, and some of their specific interests that might be different than most of Chittenden County or Brattleboro or a few other of the larger communities. I also am very active in the National Guard and Veteran Affairs Caucus. It's a small caucus, but represents a group that's very important to our state. I've recently joined in with Representative Noyes, Older Vermonter Caucus, and a new caucus that was recently formed, which is for a healthcare caucus, which obviously it's a crisis and a need across every range in our demographics. Dan's caucus is important because of our demographics. We are one of the oldest, if not the oldest states in the United States, age-wise. And other than that, I could get into some of the important bills we're working on, but we want to hear from you. I'll pass the mic on to Representative Noyes.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Dan Noyes. I represent Wolcott, Hyde Park, Johnson, and Belvedere. I'm on the Human Services Committee, and thank you for the shout out for the Older Vermonters Caucus. We meet every Wednesday at noon and talk about the issues that affect older Vermonters. We actually had Sheriff Marcoux there talking about financial exploitation of older Vermonters and how we can help people who are get stuck with that and how we can prevent that in the future.
I'm Lucy Boyden. I represent District Lamoille 3, which is Cambridge and Waterville. With Representative Higley, I sit on the Committee of Government Operations and Military Affairs, and I'm also a member of the Rural Caucus.
Great. Thanks. So we'll go ahead and get started. Elisa in the back there is going to have a sort of roving mic, and she'll kind of rove around. One thing I did notice, I see one of our board members out there, Dodie Day, is here. So I don't know if you'd give her a wave, but we always appreciate Dodie. She's been a board member for a couple of years, a year maybe now. But she was also Vermont Realtor of the Year this year. So we're pretty excited about that. Okay, so we'll go ahead and dive in. I know it's always hard to break the ice, but if there's anybody out there brave enough to ask the first question, we'd be ever grateful. Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Good morning, Judy Bickford. Many towns have been, I'm from Morrisville, many communities have eliminated town meeting day. And along with that, they've decided to send out the ballots. And what's happening is we're forbidden from doing our informational meeting about our budget until 10 days before town meeting day is happening, the first Tuesday of March. So people have their ballots already. We're not able to have our informational meeting because of the state statute. So if that can be changed, I think that would give the towns a lot more flexibility. Since things are changing rapidly, then we need to keep up with that, with the requirements put on the local communities.
I hate to hop in, but this is kind of pertinent. The other thing it does by saying it has to be within 10 days, it often forces the local legislative bodies to have a special meeting. And I don't know if you folks know what it's like to be at the state level, but it ain't getting any easier on the local level, and they got a lot of meetings. So it'd be nice to give them a broader window so they don't have to have special meetings in order to accommodate that aspect of the law. So I agree with her. The greater flexibility you can give us, the better. Something more than typically local legislative bodies meet bi-weekly. So think in terms of that, something maybe even 20 days would be helpful. So the ballots go out for February. That might be a little bit of a stretch, but I think I defer to the Clerks Association about when they start seeing them turn around and come in. We can follow up with some information to you in that regard, in terms of when people really start returning their ballots.
Yeah, thank you for that. So again, Senator Ann Watson, I am a former mayor of Montpelier, and so I totally sympathize with this restriction. I'm also on the Government Operations Committee, and one of the bills that we are currently actively working on is it's S55. It's a open meeting law adjustment, and so we're in it right now with the requirements or restrictions on particularly anybody that is subject to open meeting law. And so it seems like this is something that we could potentially take up to fit into this bill. It's possible that the chair or that other folks may not want to fit something like that in this year because it's an election year. And usually we only work on elections issues in the off year. But since this would apply to some future year and not this year, it may be something that we could take up. But I appreciate that comment, and I'm going to make sure that we raise it in government operations. Thank you.
Any other thoughts on that? Okay. Well, yeah, go ahead.
How many days do you think it should be?
Right, great.
Ron Stancliffe, Morristown. I have a degree in civil engineering. I'm also a licensed surveyor. I've heard that there's a bill that may be before the legislature to speed up surveying practices here in Vermont by the means of taking away the requirement for a license. I would advise that this bill not go very far, because there's already evidence of fraud in the past having to do with real estate, and the basics is surveying. And I just want to pass that on to you, that and also on Act 250, let's protect what we have here in Vermont, which are our high hills, our streams, and our way of life. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, Ron, I appreciate your insights and experience. You know, there's someone in the room named former Commissioner Mike Snyder, who is a storied author, and one of his pieces and essays was on an acre is an acre. And that's it. An acre is a two-dimensional surface. It's not three-dimensional. So I would laud what you're saying. I haven't heard rumor of this bill, but as someone who is lead sponsor of a timber trespass and fraud bill currently that's been announced in the House, we rely on licensed surveyors for accuracy all over the state, and pulling that requirement would be grievous, in my opinion.
Thanks, Jed.
Thank you. So I haven't heard of the first part of your comment about the potential for removing licenses from surveyors. So thank you for putting that on my radar. I'm not sure if anybody has other things to say about that. I'm happy to pass along the mic as well. But to the second part, you mentioned Act 250. And so sitting on the Natural Resources and Energy Committee, we have been talking about reforms to Act 250. And just to take a second on that, because I know that is a big issue. Within the last couple of months of 2023, there were 3 reports that came to the legislature, which all had this somewhat miraculous alignment in their suggestions on how Act 250 could be reformed. And because we know it was not doing a great job of encouraging development where we want development and preventing development where we don't want it. And so this package of recommendations that we're looking at right now shifts the paradigm of Act 250 from a threshold-based regulation. So like if you build too much or too fast, it triggers Act 250. That's the current paradigm. This new paradigm is location-based. So it's going to be very map heavy, but it would designate places where, around our village centers or downtowns where we want to see more development. It would encourage development there, places that are already well regulated. And it would also identify places that are that really, it doesn't matter how much you're building, it needs to go through a permitting process, even if it's one unit of housing. Places like our stream headwaters, or places that are in river corridors, or places that or are just important and unique environmental or like ecologically important places. So that's where we're headed, and happy to talk more about that. But that's sort of the 30,000 foot view of some changes that are coming to Act 250, which hopefully will do a better job of protecting those wonderful, unique places that we all love, and will hopefully do a better job at allowing development in our already developed, impacted areas.
Anybody else on that? I had a follow up on Act 250, shockingly enough, I suppose. So here in Lamoille County, obviously we had some flooding recently. And a lot of I believe we only have one designated downtown in Lamoille County. I believe it's here in Stowe. We have some other varying levels of that in a couple other townships, but most of those occur directly in the flood zone. So when we talk about Act 250 being in designated centers and they're located in flood zones, there's a concern. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, this is a big question. So, and just for reference, the Act 250 bill that at least my committee is working on is S308. And then there's another bill that we're working on, which is S213, which is about specifically development in wetlands, river corridors, floodplains, and it also has to do with dam safety. But I think what we need to do is consider, where are we purposefully armoring our rivers and streams? Like, where are we going to continue to maintain development in these areas that are at some risk? And where do we need to, or where do we have the opportunity to develop more floodplains so that the river can expand when we have these big flood events? So the FEMA maps, we know first of all, they're out of date. They're being updated. There's a schedule for when those FEMA maps are going to be updated. But for now, they are mostly underestimating the extent to that the river might experience an inundation event. But the river corridors is another thing entirely, because we know that rivers meander around an area, and so that's a much wider consideration. So S213, one of the things that it's considering is looking at our river corridors on a much larger basis, potentially on a statewide basis. So this isn't to say that that we won't be allowing any more development in impacted or floodplain areas, but that we need to be intentional about, like, where are we going to continue to try to restrict the river, and where are we going to try to discourage development so that the river can expand. I don't know if I've really answered your question, but
yeah, it sounds like Jed has some thoughts. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, would there ever be consideration of less restriction outside of a designated downtown or something of that nature?
Yeah. So one of the things about the package of changes that we're looking at for Act 250 includes some radius around our downtowns or village centers, because we know a lot of those places are right in the floodplain. So trying to expand it so that there is some allowance for expanding, especially outside of the floodplains.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Thank you. Jed?
Thank you, Pat. And I also want to point out that Senator Watson most cordially sent me paper copies of the 3 reports. I saw her last week ago today, and by Wednesday morning, I had them in my committee room. So thank you, Ann, for that. But regarding Act 250, it's all well and good when to talk about expanding density in downtown areas, village areas, and some extended village areas, with the caveat that those areas are served with public water and public sewer. And I reckon that about 3% of Vermont may have municipal water and sewer. That leaves 97% of our state that is not covered. It's covered by a policy administered by the Department of Environmental Conservation, which requires a wastewater permit, also known as a septic system and a leach field, and a well permit. So I'm very concerned, and Senator Watson articulated that Act 250 in 1970 was a threshold base, or as amended became a threshold base. But everyone recognizes that housing is probably Vermont's #1 crisis, and it's impacting us in every way imaginable. So on the Rural Caucus, we are pushing to get, I won't call it myopic, but it's a very narrow focus on downtowns and public utility-served centers to accommodate rural towns and communities, which actually is a vast majority of Vermont, in ways particular that do protect sensitive areas, obviously certain elevations and other environmental considerations. But that's the focus that I'm working on with fellow Rural Caucus members to make sure that the vast part of Vermonters are not left out of these revisions. Thanks.
Just to follow up, I also serve on the Rural Caucus, and am working with in the House on some legislation that removes barriers to development in rural Vermont, in our village centers for housing for older Vermonters. We often forget that a lot of our housing stock that's way up on East Hill or wherever, where older Vermonters are living, they have no place to go. So they're going to stay there. And if we had the ability to develop in our village centers on our fixed route transportation outside the floodplain, very important to 2 towns that I represent because they both flooded, to be able to provide access to housing and just remove barriers. It's unfortunately economies of scale are that they need to develop larger buildings to make it cost effective, but in rural Vermont, that doesn't really fit in. So you're not going to build a 30-unit senior housing in Belvedere, but maybe there is the opportunity to build smaller housing, 6 or 7 units. So thank you.
All right. You see, where are we? One here, and then there's one there and there. We'll get to you.
Hi, good morning. My name's Ryan Hardy. I'm the superintendent for Lamoille South, representing Elmore, Morristown, and Stowe. First, I just want to thank you all for being here and for taking the time out of your day to speak with us and to serve Vermonters. So thank you. I'm coming to you today because I'm very concerned about Act 127 and the impact that it's going to have on our towns. Last Thursday, Representative Kornheiser and Peter Conlon from the Ed Committee announced to our Vermont superintendents that they're considering removal of the 5% cap provision, which is in Act 127. So for everyone here to be aware of the consequence of that, Stowe would see a property tax increase of 60% is our initial estimates on that. Our other towns are seeing double-digit increases as well. And I view this as probably the #1 issue that we're facing right now. And so I'm coming to you and asking for your support and asking, for any feedback or anything that either you can do or we can do to try to prevent this sort of tax impact on our community, because I can tell you it would be devastating for many of our families and also for people living in our towns. Thank you.
Guess we ripped the Band-Aid off early today. Thank you for the question.
So this issue really doesn't go through government operations, but it's a huge concern. And I read this the last time. This came from Scott Beck, who is on Ways and Means Committee, in regards to where the overall costs and education funding are coming from. And it's quite a laundry list. Universal school meals added $28 million. Healthcare premiums went up 16%. Very high school staffing ratios. Inflation on everything else. Student weighting changes. Failure to fully implement special education reform from 2018. Increases in the pension costs of $10 million. Collective bargaining agreements. The retention of school positions being funded by one-time COVID dollars. High capital construction costs. A cap on district rates that has encouraged spending. And a consumption tax growth that has returned to 2%. And then even during the Budget Adjustment Act, a piece of it did come through GovOps in regards to back, I believe it was in 2016, the retired teachers' cost of living increases based on the Consumer Price Index. Well, in 2016, it was so low that it would have meant a negative COLA for retired teachers. So back then, we worked out an agreement that that would not happen, but there was a cap. Well, now we've reached the cap because the Consumer Price Index is over 7%. So we had to renegotiate in a sense, and that is costing, it cost $3.2 million last year and $9.1 million this year, and that's coming out of the reserve fund, the Education Reserve Fund. So all these things add up to these increases, and again, I think there's maybe one or two people in the state that I know of that even understand the total education funding mechanism. I mean, I certainly couldn't begin to explain it to you. But the other thing that is of concern, and you may have heard about the 18.5% increase possibility, well, I just received an email from a member of the Appropriations Committee who said that they've looked at the final figures coming in of more than 14.5% increase across the board for school budgets. And so now that's going to be, we're looking at possibly even a higher percentage increase. Where this all ends, I don't know. Again, we always seem to nip around the edges, whether it was for this weighting process, and the caps, and it appears that many school districts went to that cap and even exceeded it. And again, the way the system is set up is little old Lowell, Vermont will be paying for the overall education tax throughout the state. So it's pretty frustrating, and it's very frustrating. As a matter of fact, even the PCB testing issue, you might have remembered we put $32 million into testing. Lo and behold, Burlington grabbed $16 million of it. I talked to a reporter the other day and said, why don't you mention that? He looked at my name tag and said, oh, Northeast Kingdom. I can probably see why. Again, it's those sorts of things that are super frustrating, and I've certainly been reached out more than ever from my superintendents in regards to whether it's a PCB issue or this new cap issue and the increase in funding. The common level of appraisal, as you are probably aware, has an effect on it. That in most of my towns in 1 year has gone down by 10%. I mean, Lowell last year was around 84% common level appraisal. Now we're down to 73. We are going through a reappraisal, but it's all part of this, and it all has to do with increased property taxes, which is, in my mind, number one issue is affordability in Vermont. Number two, I agree with the governor on this, and I've reported it myself. Number two is the crime and drug use, and number three is housing. So affordability, we got to get it under control because my folks just can't afford to live here anymore if we keep it up.
Yeah, I agree with Representative Higley that this is really a key issue. And since we got the December letter where they talked about an 18% increase, we've been talking, Senator Cummings isn't here, but I have a lot of conversations with her. She's the chair of the Finance Committee, so she's really the key person in the Senate that's dealing with the education tax. But, 2 years ago when we were passing this bill, I don't think there was a single superintendent that said don't do it. But it was a lot of pressure to get it passed. I had concerns about doing it the way we were doing it, not doing more, categorical aid and instead using this formula. I think categorical aid is a lot clearer. Also, the Senate had a plan to do the weights, just blend in the weights over 5 years. It was the House that decided to do this 5% cap. And we're getting to the position now where people kind of purposely went up to the 9.9%. So then, but they're limited to 5%. So they had to be picked up by Lowell and everybody else. And now they go over 5%. And so that money gets spread around. So now we're at the point that every school in the state is over 5%. So if you keep the cap, and everybody's over the cap, then the only way to get the tax rate to work is just to keep lowering the yield. And you could just lower the yield to like 0 or something. So it's the formula is kind of broken. It's already a super complicated system. So I think that's why the Ways and Means of the House Committee was like, maybe we just have to get rid of this cap. I don't know if I can see why that's a horrible idea because of the timing. Schools have already established their budgets. They were told one thing, and then this would be pulling the rug out from them. But on the other hand, I don't know what the other solution is because nobody wants to see these huge tax increases go. So either we redistribute the money amongst the tax districts, different tax, the different school districts differently, or we spend less money. But then that's a local decision. The legislature doesn't tell the local districts how much money to spend. So that's voters. Some people are saying, voters will vote these budgets down, but I don't want to advocate for people to vote budgets down, and I don't know if that'll happen. So the local districts will spend money, and we have to raise the rates to come up with that. Or we have to take general fund money to help put into the education fund to help lower the rate. And there might be some opportunity to do that, but the general fund is under, constraints as well. So where we get the money is the main question. And do we have enough to make a sizable reduction in that rate? Because there are other pressures, as was mentioned. What I've asked the Joint Fiscal Office is how much is due to weighting, how much is due to the insurance, how much is just due to increased spending. We spent decades, if not generations, underfunding school construction. So where we have a lot more expenses. When I was on education, we were the ones that initiated the school construction report that just came out, and it's billions of dollars, which we expected it would be close to $1 billion. It's over $1 billion of deferred maintenance and construction costs since we have stopped state aid into school construction. So we have to figure out some way to help schools with those construction costs. So it's just all these different pressures coming down. But as other people said, the taxpayers can't afford, definitely not a 60% tax increase, but not even a 20% tax increase. So it is, I would say it's the number one thing we're trying to figure out as the session moves along. And I'm hoping we can figure it out. But right now, I don't have a good answer for you about how we're going to do it.
Yep. Thank you, Senator and Representative Higley. I was a little over a week ago, went down as liaison to the Education Committee, met the Stowe School Board Chairman, and got to hear from over 25 superintendents and school board leaders on Zoom from every corner of the state. And they all were horrified by the impacts that were looming on 127. The only thing I've heard since then, and by the way, Superintendent Harity was very impactful in his testimony. And affordability, I agree with Mark. Right now, in most towns and cities in Vermont, is probably our number one crisis. And but that was on my number one list 18 months ago when I first threw my hat in the ring about the sustainability and affordability. But to get back to 127, there's, when you shake hands as a Vermonter, that means something. When you renege on that handshake, that's disgraceful. But when you pull the rug out of this 5% cap hours before annual meeting long after school boards all over the state have submitted their budgets. That's absolutely unacceptable. So I urge everyone up on this stage that represents different committees to at least at a minimum understand that every Southern Berkshire, Southern Lamoille district town, Stowe would rise the least. And that would be in the mid 20%. Elmore, Morristown would suffer worse. So please advocate with all your positions of power and experience. And it may only be that, that Lucy and I were not there when, in 2022. Maybe Ann Watson wasn't either, but so we're not dodging responsibility. We do have responsibility today, and I would urge everyone in our organization to fight back to protect these towns in our district. Thank you.
Any more on that? Oh, Lucy's got.
I just wanted to agree with everything that has been said. Everyone has been really well spoken. And this is a really complex issue that our school boards have been responding to. We have major needs coming from our schools that have come at a really high cost, and especially at a time when state money is kind of all out of whack, and also federal money has dried up as well. Vermont has a really expensive education system, and so addressing this cost will not come easy or quick. We have no overnight solution. So whether it's looking at the formula or coming up with funds that come from somewhere else, nothing will be easy.
Did you have someone over here more? Okay. I'm just curious, and I realize that the school budgets are voted on by towns and things of that nature, but of the folks we have here, would you encourage reduced spending? Some? Yes? No? No, it's a difficult question.
So certainly, and I don't know how we get this through to schools. I know in one of our caucus meetings we had, actually it was Scott Beck who presented and said that there will be an opportunity for schools to open up their budgets again. But again, I think it was Thursday, they were supposed to have their budgets warned. So what does that mean? Does that mean that, you know, you go through the whole process and then after town meeting, you vote again to open up your budgets? Yeah, it's a tough situation, and I'm not on a school board. I'm a lister, so I see it on that end with people coming at me saying, "Why did you raise my taxes?" And of course, I'm just a lister, not a select board member or school board member. But that's, yeah, I don't know where the answer lies, but you know, going back even to school construction, as the senator mentioned. There was a report out, I guess they did another study, $6.3 billion of needed school construction in the next 12 years or so. And they're looking in Ways and Means again about, $400 million roughly of yearly funding. And they're looking at every tax under the sun, cloud tax, rooms and meals tax, sales tax, sugary beverage tax. And again, it's just, I don't know where it ends, but it's certainly concerning.
I wouldn't say just over across the board reduce schools funding. I think schools need money, obviously. But what I think could be done is make a better connection between your vote for your school budget and your local tax. I think because of the complicated system, it's not clear sometimes when you vote for a budget what that means to your local tax. And I think there's that disconnect causes some school budgets to be higher. People want to support the school. They want to have well-educated children. They want to support the next generation. But how that affects their taxes, it's not really clear. And so there's been some ideas floated out there in the past of how to make that connection more clear, how to make the formula less complicated. And that might help, just control some spending. But also, we have these costs that are spread out amongst, towns that have more resources and bigger ground lists and towns that don't. And there is this question on a lot of the smaller towns in our district are really struggling. Do we keep a school open that has 70 students in it? And what is the cost of that? And what does that cost to all the other states? But those little towns are adamant that their small schools stay open. But I know it's a question that we have to answer our whole state. How important is that for the state and for those towns and the survivability of those towns if they didn't have a local school? But those are just a couple things that get discussed.
Okay, right over here. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So a couple things. One, you referred to the removing of the 5% cap, and the control that the legislature has is the yield, and that's correct. But you talked about taking it all the way down to zero. The projections that I saw out of House Ways and Means that once you hit a yield of 7,000, every single district in the state has hit the 5% cap. So therefore, whether you reduce the yield or not, it makes zero difference. So once you're down to 7,000, that's the max that the legislature can use to manipulate, is not a good word, but manipulate the formula to get enough money in. So the question is, where does other money come from if you don't repeal this 5% or Act 127 in general? And forgive me, but the way you made it sound was that there are no other levers. The other lever is the non-homestead tax rate. So, and nobody's talking about that for good reason, because then everybody would be screaming in the state. But I just don't want people to forget that that's not another source of money here to get into the system. The problem, going back to what Representative Higley said, Scott Beck's list, all of those factors are, I agree with every single one in terms of rising education costs. The one thing that was not on that list, which is, I think, the most pertinent right now, is the Act 127 legislation. So Act 127 has an effect of increasing overall education spending indefinitely. So the intent was to shift money from many school districts to a few. And then the idea was that those districts over 5 years would reduce their spending so that those few districts could have that money. The problem, and what was gravely overlooked, is that most of these school districts have operated in a very fiscally responsible manner, and they cannot make the cuts that are required to get the additional money to those few school districts. And I'll use Stowe as an example because I know these numbers the best. For the Stowe School District to cut enough money out of our budget to look at only a 10% increase in property taxes, we'd have to cut over $4 million out of a $17 million budget. It's 35 teachers. Do we have 100 teachers? So we could just close Stowe Elementary School. If the goal is for students and children in towns like Stowe to not be able to receive a public education in their town, we are on the right track. We would literally have to close schools in order to make this happen. So what concerns me the most is that Representative Emily Kornheiser, who's the architect of Act 127 and sits as the chair of House Ways and Means, is now, as the chair of House Ways and Means, the one in charge of getting enough money into the ed fund due to this legislation that was passed. The legislation was passed in 2022, and nobody realized the impact that it was going to have until a couple months ago, right? So my concern is that the same people in charge are now within a week going to make an appropriate change to legislation that's going to, quote unquote, fix the issue. I find that very hard to believe that that's possible. And I think that leads me to I think we have two choices as a state here. And this is a statewide issue. This affects every single person in the state in a very impactful way. And the two choices that we have are either to let it be, and, it was very unfortunate legislation that was passed, and we have to just suck it up and move forward, and then hopefully change something down the road for this year. or we can repeal Act 127. Making changes to the law, to the parts of the law that they think are the issue, is not acceptable. And it's not doing any service to any student or taxpayer in this state. And I ask you and beg you to not vote in favor of any legislation that just makes changes to it. Please either vote to repeal Act 127, pass emergency legislation to let school districts go back to the drawing board and redo their budgets under the old system to pass at extended town meeting day, or to just ride out this year under really bad legislation that was passed almost unanimously, and then move forward in a more thoughtful and time planned manner. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Tiffany Dondra. I live in Stowe.
I think we had some folks in the back. I saw some hands.
Hi, I'm Laura Streets, currently select board in Morristown and Morrisville Farmers Market. I want to address the fact that every news feed I get from Forbes, Kiplinger's, Wall Street Journal constantly mention that Vermont is one of 10 states that tax Social Security. With an aging population, first of all, that's just bad PR for the state. Second of all, because a large portion of people have taken Social Security early, we have greatly reduced our workforce because they are now penalized for working because of the taxation on Social Security. So I would like everyone to rethink that. Let's not be one of the 10 states that do that. And with the current situation, we're currently driving senior citizens out of their homes with all these taxes. And then we're paying people $10,000 to move here. That's just crazy. Absolutely crazy to me. So again, I think we can improve our workforce. One other thing I want to mention quickly is the DCF, being at the Morrisville Farmers Market, actually turned down federal funding for funding to feed children during summer because they don't have the staffing or the computer system. I would really like you guys to revisit that. Let's find some way to get that money into town. It's huge money for farmers markets to feed the children. Given what has happened with the farmers, they desperately need this money. Our children need this money. This is federal tax money that we can get back into the state, and it's going to go right to our farmers, who many were devastated from the floods. So, thank you.
Dan, let's go to Dan. Let's start.
Quick. I put in the bill to repeal the tax on Social Security since I've been down there. I'm working on it right now with Representative Harrison, and I have a bill in, and we went to Ways and Means, and they gave us 10 minutes, maybe. So it's definitely not on their radar. And then to your point on the computer system for DCF, I'm on the board that is the Office of the Child Advocate. And if you read the report that just came out from that office, it's pretty clear that we're leaving a ton of federal money on the table, not only for food, but for mental health care and everything, because we can't answer basic questions about how we're providing services to children in this state through that computer system. I know it's in the budget, starting to be in the budget this year. It's going to be big bucks. But it's not just the DCF computer system, it's pretty much all of them.
So, as Representative Noyes said, there's been bills out there in all the bienniums recently to do just that. There's another bill that I've signed on to as well in regards to exempting retired military pensions. We just talked to General Knight. He had a series of National Guard events down there this past week, and we mentioned that again. As you can imagine, just going a little bit into the National Guard one, these folks that retire out of the military are generally pretty young folks. So there's an opportunity there for them to go back into the workforce here in Vermont. There's also the opportunity for the option for other states to consider Vermont if they had that exemption. And it isn't happening, and they're leaving. They're leaving in droves. As soon as they retire, they're looking for a state where they can live more comfortably. And I just said it, affordability is the number one issue here. So my request to you folks is, if that's a real concern, reach out to the Speaker of the House, at least in the House side, because again, she's the one who sets the agenda. Nothing gets taken up in a committee unless she knows about it and approves it.
Just on the Social Security and we're talking about the military pensions, the reason I don't support just a blanket prohibition or exemption on those taxes is because it's not means-based. So we don't tax Social Security if you're very low income. I think that could be raised so that higher low income seniors don't have to pay taxes on that. But if you're a very wealthy senior, I don't see why we would cut their taxes to raise taxes somewhere else on somebody else that can't afford it. And that's the same reason that I would support exemption of military pay if it was for based on means, like how much money they're making. Sometimes you could be a general and be getting a pension and have worked another job and are getting two pensions and working, as a consultant and are making plenty of money that you would be able to pay those taxes. And also, I've talked to veterans that, served in Afghanistan or in other combat roles, but they don't have a pension. So we're saying, thank you for your service, but you don't get a break on your pension because you didn't do 20 years. And the military system of who gets pensions has been shown not to be equitable. I think the military is getting a lot better with that. Now they have different retirement systems, so I think it'll get better over time. But that's why I don't just support a blanket. I would want to target it. If I want to support veterans, I'd rather say, how can we make sure their kids have health care? How can we make sure they have health care? How can we do other things for veterans instead of just saying a blanket tax break regardless of how much they make? And that's the same for seniors. If we do just a blanket Social Security exemption, we have to come up with that money somewhere else. I'd rather take that money and put it toward the many things that Representative Noyes could talk about that is needed by seniors today if we have limited the money. So that's just my position, which might be a little different than others at least on that issue.
A couple more comments over on this side.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. With all due respect, Senator, I was in that committee caucus meeting last week with Representative Higley, and for a long time, the Guard has said they're not looking for pensions for officer grade. They're looking for pensions and willing to cut it off at a more like an E5 or E6 level. So that argument is not accurate. That bill is not left a wall and won't. And the speaker was at an emergency meeting down in Northfield at Norwich. I don't know if you were there. There's a crisis. Like every business in this state, there's a workforce issue. And when you serve 20 years, there's no moral equivalent of having 20 years where you didn't have Christmas with your family, you didn't have Thanksgiving, many events. People say, well, it's the same difference as if a fireman served his community or an EMT. It's not a moral equivalent. Most of these folks have been out in the field and in combat zones in some of the worst places on the planet. And all they're asking for, these are not high-grade officers, to come back and serve their communities and serve their state. Our Guard has a lot of highly educated, multiple certifications that could fill workforce positions, but they leave, they go to New Hampshire, they go all over, they go to New York State, the Carolinas, Tennessee, because there's no taxation on those pensions. It is not a privilege for the upper echelons of the military. It's the ones that would actually fill jobs in our community. So I strongly would urge again everyone on this stage to reach out, look at the details, reach out to the speaker, and get support so that bill can finally have the light of day in the House chamber. Thank you.
I'll be quick. Just on the workforce, I put a bill in to frame the removing the tax on pensions for military and had it go to commerce. So I was really looking at it as a way to kind of build our workforce, and it actually got some pretty good testimony in commerce. I was figuring that would be a way to move this forward. It didn't make it out of commerce last session, but I'll keep trying. If it could move to Ways and Means coming out of a committee of jurisdiction looking at workforce development, there's more apt for them to take it off the wall, but they're not going to take it off the wall in Ways and Means.
Thanks. Another question?
Hi, I'm Alan Willett, Stowe resident and member of the Stowe School Board. Just wanted to say, I think the underlying concept for Act 127 makes sense. It costs more to educate a student where English isn't their primary language, etc. I think Act 127 is sort of the straw that has broken our education funding models back. Somehow in the implementation of Act 127, there's an assumption that, this must mean that districts with a majority of students that don't fall under the Act 127 are spending too much. So they should be able to spend less in order to do this, rather than trying to identify an additional source for the additional money to educate non-education or non-English speakers. I think the way we fund education in Vermont based on property assessments is suspect, because we're taxing based on people's perceived values of their property with no correlation to their ability to pay taxes. And I think, any efforts to sort of fix Act 127 are trying to rearrange chairs on the Titanic. We need to really leave it as it is for this year, move and reevaluate how we are funding education in the state. Short term, one of our big cost drivers this go round was the 16% negotiated healthcare increase, which was done at the state level. We have no control over it, but it affects our budgets. It seems to me that should get moved out of the individual education budgets to, move the teachers' healthcare into the state employees' healthcare plan and just fund that through the general budget. Another possibility for raising additional revenue for this cycle is maybe a 1% sales tax, rather than trying to figure out how to pay for education through property taxes. Yeah. Thank you.
I know it's a common thought I've heard a few times. I don't know if anyone has.
Yeah, I'm open to other ways of trying to figure it out. I haven't heard a good way of getting off of property tax. I was on the income-based education tax, just tying it directly to income. And when I went into that summer study committee, I was convinced that was the way to go. But by talking to the analysts and the fiscal analysts and the tax professionals, it just had its own. We were just switching from this group of problems to that group of problems. So I wasn't convinced that was better, because we already have 2/3 of people basically paying on income already because of the income sensitivity. So, it's kind of like other comments. It's Act 127. There was a lot of support for it. Like I think was said, it was almost unanimous. And we did have numbers. I remember going to the Montpelier-Roxbury School Board and saying, are you sure you want us to do this? Because here we did know that the tax increase was going to be very large for some communities. It wasn't a total surprise. We had charts that would show you're either going to have to lower your spending to a crazy amount or increase your taxes. And my concern at the time was that the communities that got taxing capacity wouldn't use it to increase education opportunities for the English language learners. They would just lower their taxes. And communities like Stowe would just have to increase their taxes, but we weren't actually getting better education. We were just lowering the taxes for these other communities. So without some kind of mechanism to make sure that the money was being spent in those communities, you're just raising taxes by some and lowering taxes for others based on their pupil weights, not by really what the education spending is for those pupils. But myself, Senator Hardy, were pushed aside on that issue and said, no, you can't tell those local communities that have these high levels of English language learners that they have to spend the money a certain way. You just have to give them the tax capacity because that's the fair way to do it. And they won that argument at the time. So I started the session when I heard about the numbers coming out about tax increases, that maybe repealing it or just maybe not repealing it, but delaying it for a few years till we figured it out. But there's not the votes there to do that. And back to the other comment about we can't lower the yield below 7. That's why the House Ways and Means Committee was saying get rid of the 5%, because if you have the 5%, you can't lower the yield because it just pushes everybody goes over 5%. But if everybody's limited to 5%, you got to come up with the money somewhere. Even if you close your school, you don't save any money because you still got to constitutionally pay for those kids' education. So you'd send them to some other school and pay it anyway. So I hear the issues and I agree with them. But like I said earlier, I don't have a good answer other than we might just have to, as was mentioned, not pull the rug out from the local schools and somehow bring the money in from the general fund and figure out a way to provide that tax stability of 5% to the communities. But if the number is such a huge amount, I'm not sure where we come up with the money.
A lot
Thank
of questions. Yeah, go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry.
Yeah.
Just to add briefly to that, that's why I just want to sympathize with the comment, and that I do think it's worth looking at how our education system is funded in general. And while this is not a short-term solution or conversation, it gets at a bigger issue, which I think is a huge issue for our society in general, which is wealth inequality. And how do we make sure that we are taxing appropriately, especially given that some people are doing significantly better than other people. And so one of the things that government operations did last session was a study to see what kinds of properties do we have in Vermont, in terms of second homes or mansions or just the variety of ways that we could look at our tax structure in general that would get away from just property valuation. Looking at land value taxation, as if anybody is familiar with that as a structure. So I think there are other options, including looking at income. That's a much longer conversation, but I think that if we're going to look at other means, then the study that we did last year to see what the landscape in Vermont is of these different kinds of properties is going to be really helpful for thinking about future restructuring.
Thanks. And I saw a lot of questions. I'm just going to make a comment in terms of school taxation and whatnot. And what we've seen in some other states, I believe New York recently put a cap on what the annual increases in those school budgets can be at the rate of inflation, 3% or the rate of inflation, which puts the onus on the school, to stay within that. And they've been able to do so. I saw a bunch of hands.
Well, I have the mic. Right
here. There you
go. Oh, yeah. So Randall Zott, all the discussion about Act 127 so far has, in my view, treated it a little bit as like a snapshot, in that it sort of like says, here's what Act 127 is, and here's how it weights pupils, et cetera, et cetera. But there was a history there that led to the passage of 127, and that's a piece that adds a little bit more to like the moral quandary of the whole problem, which is that the original weights that were used and were adjusted in Act 127 were found to have been basically drawn from thin air. And so we had communities historically who had been paying for 10, 20 years more than they should have been paying to deliver the education that they did to their students because they had been paying at the wrong weights or fabricated weights, essentially. So Act 127, my understanding was like a way to address the fact that some communities have been overpaying for decades while other communities have been underpaying for decades. And so Act 127 was an attempt to kind of smooth out that adjustment, because it was going to be a very rough adjustment for communities that had historically been able to deliver a lot more per dollar because of the weights, whereas other communities had to spend a lot more to get even baseline levels of education. So when we talk about solutions to this problem, it's even more complicated because there's communities that have a very legitimate view, sense of wanting to be made whole. Like, hey, we spent all this money. We overtaxed our populace for 10, 15 years. And now we want immediate relief. And all the communities that have been underpaying to deliver services are saying like, well, hey, we can't just shoulder this all at once. But we really, when we talk about making handshakes and promises to people, one of the things is we have to say like, yeah, the decisions that we made 10, 15 years ago that turned out to be incorrect, we have an obligation to make those communities whole. And so we can't just say to the communities that are having to bear the impact of like, yeah, we have to do this. We can't just focus on them and the impact on them. We have to look at all those communities for decades who are overpaying to educate their kids.
A lot of questions on this side of the room. And just as a time check, we've got 6 minutes. So, yeah, Jed has a quick comment.
Yeah, I love to see the public come to a meeting where they want their voices heard or their questions asked. So I would move that we don't give them only 5.5 minutes left. That some of us are willing to stay here a little later in the morning to make sure everyone's voice is heard. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Jed. And I'm happy to stick around if we want a less formal discussion. It sounds like Jed's willing to stick around and chat with the folks. Yeah.
I'm David Bickford. I'm chair of the Elmore Morristown School Board and chair of the Lamoille South School Board. I'm quite certain that you have been struck, as I have, about the irony of this discussion this morning. We began by talking about how important housing is and the need for affordable housing. We talked about the affordability of living in our communities and in our state. We talked about the burden of taxes. The heart of the matter for me is the fact that we have a regressive tax system. We are, by increasing our property taxes, we are increasing the burden on the folks who are our residents, long-term residents. We are not taxing the folks who have second homes valued at $1 million, $1.5 million, $2 million. And we are burdening the very folks that make up our workforce, who can't afford to live in our communities, who are then cascading themselves to communities further away from our centers, really militating against some of the planning that we have to concentrate around our centers. I urge you to repeal 127. And I think you're going to face in the next 2 or 3 days an effort to tweak it yet again. We have the talent, we have the expertise and experience to come up with a mixed type of tax that is based on income, supplements it with property tax on folks whose ability to pay may be greater than our residents. In the meantime, I think it's quite unconscionable to think that we're going to pull the rug out from under our school boards that have done their due diligence in preparing budgets. And I urge you to reject any of the bills and actions that come before the legislature in the next 2 or 3 weeks to undo the contract that has been built between the state funding mechanism and your local school boards to develop budgets to go before the voters.
Thanks. You got a quick response.
Yeah, so if it's a quick response, again, I just want to remind folks that that non-residential rate is also for businesses. So we have to be careful there.
Thanks. Okay, we got enough time for one more question.
Thank you. And my name is Caleb Grant. I'm the Executive Director of Rural Community Transportation. And I'll just note that I see a lot of parallels between the funding and transportation and education in the sense that there's really little incentive to be frugal and innovate. I know in the transportation realm, we aggressively cut underperforming routes and we drive beat up minivans because it's the most cost effective way to give rides. And that does not reduce the size of the pie. It reduces our portion. So I think I see it in school boards as well, as you're trying to represent your community well and make sure that they aggressively get their portion of the funding that's being spent. So I guess I would just implore people to incentivize innovation and frugality, because that's really the best path forward. But I'm also here as the treasurer of the Lamoille area recovery network, which is the response network, the citizen-led response network to the flooding. And I'm constantly amazed that we even have to exist. It seems that disaster relief is not something a volunteer organization should be doing. But I, at this time last week, was in Waterbury for the summit of the long-term recovery groups, which is FEMA, the state of Vermont, and the long-term recovery groups. And we heard presentation after presentation by the state about their learning, their studies, and what they plan to do going forward. And Sue Minter, just checking, she stood up and said, "Wow, I heard all these things after Irene." So I just want to kind of reiterate that we need to address these things, the regional response, the ability to scale. All these types of disaster relief things are lessons that cannot be forgotten or left to volunteer organizations to try to do this very complicated. And oftentimes I find myself, I shouldn't be making these decisions. These are disaster recovery. These are human services types of things. So I guess just learn from the learnings of Irene and make sure that this ball is not dropped moving forward.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to give everybody a chance to kind of close out here, but we'll start with you, Ann. Just wanted to thank everybody for coming. I apologize. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions. We do have a limited amount of time, but we do have 2 more breakfasts coming up, one in Johnson in March and one at Smugs in April, and I'm sure these issues will continue to be discussed. So, and I also want to thank everybody, the reps and the folks who came today, for a good civil discourse here today. So we'll just hear one last, and anyone who wants to stick around, there's a little bit of food left, hopefully some coffee. Feel free to mingle.
Thank you for that question. So in my government operations committee, one of the big bills that we're working on right now is the flood response bill, thinking about how state government could have responded differently or better, and what lesson, exactly what you're talking about, like what lessons do we need to learn? So we've heard from many stakeholders about this question. And so that bill is likely to come out of committee in the next couple of weeks, but it includes, things like, do we need to have like reverse 911, right? Like alerts getting sent out. That didn't happen in the flooding in July. We're going to be talking about, like, do we need caseworkers? So many people had a difficult time navigating FEMA, having caseworkers able to just help people navigate funding sources and a program through FEMA that's really not designed to actually ultimately help people. Just thinking about it, well, especially like with the long-term recovery groups, we've heard from a few of them. And this is a question, like you're bringing up a question that has come up over and over again for me in committee. What is the role of private philanthropy is one way to put it, but another way to think of it is like, the long-term recovery groups and what is appropriate for the state to take on. And I tend to lean more towards it should be the state's responsibility. We rely in Vermont so much on volunteers for basically like unpaid work. I think of it as wage theft actually. But that question that you are talking about is very much in the forefront of my mind. How can the state be taking on more of the responsibility? And because really right now we are setting ourselves up for the response to the next flood. And so we need to be setting ourselves up well in terms of structures. What contracts can we have that are contingent on certain things happening so that we can stand up programs almost automatically so that they're ready to go next time instead of the delays that we saw in this last flood. So there's a lot there, but thank you. And thank you for your work in doing all of that.
So I just like to say that, we need to understand that we're a state of 640 some thousand folks. So in regards to all this stuff, whether it's where the money comes from for schools, where the money comes from for flood relief, you name it. I mean, I sat on a couple of energy summits with the Commissioner of Agency of Natural Resources, Matt Cota, Rob Roper, and so on, talking to folks in regards to, repealing the Global Warming Solutions Act, or at least falling back on Vermont's comprehensive energy plan, which is goals, not mandates. And I say that because that very thing there was a $58 million proposal in regards to recovery for, the Barre Montpelier area. And it goes on, whether it's there or Cambridge and so on. These are real costs that are going to come up that we're going to have to fund. And where do we get the money? Well, from my perspective, we can't continue to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on initiatives that are going to change the climate, because it's not going to happen. And we have to prioritize where that money goes. And if it's going to start going more towards these climate events that are going to happen, that are going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars, then we need to understand that. And it's a priority issue for me. It goes across the board. I mean, how many times have you heard this? Vermont's first with this. Vermont's first with that. I mean, Vermont's, the best possible paid family and sick leave. That was a payroll tax. That got discarded because all of a sudden now we're on a child care bill. And that got passed with a payroll tax. And again, why was there an issue? In my mind, it's because Vermont, over the years, regulated the child care industry so hard that so many of them went out of business that they couldn't afford to stay in business. So, from my perspective, the list goes on with what Vermont can and can't do. And it's great to be the first in the nation on a lot of this stuff. But again, we're only a small community of 640,000 people, not a lot of industry. We need to understand that. And I don't believe we do down there.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank the Chamber for doing this, and thanks everybody for coming out. It's really important that we get to hear directly from our constituents. We don't do it enough. So I really appreciate that this can happen, and happy to try to figure out other ways that we can do it more, because we think we have enough time, and then we never get through everybody's questions. And I feel like we didn't even really have, a full discussion on all these things. But I did want to say that the transportation issue is how we fund the local portion of the transportation costs is something we're dealing with transportation. There's a lot of analogy on who pays and how do we fund that on a statewide basis, and how do we get to these rural areas that don't have enough money to provide transportation. Because if you don't have a transportation, that's another part of the workforce problem that we have, people trying to just get to work. But I just wanted to thank everybody for coming out, and thank the Chamber for doing this so we can have these conversations.
Want to run down? You good? You happy? Okay. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you next month.